Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Seminar H of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. My name is Marjorie Cohn, and I am the Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Our topic for today is the Korean War, unresolved ongoing conflicts, and U.S. involvement. Our distinguished faculty for this seminar includes Peter Kuznick, Zhonghee Lee, Lisi Wu, and Kyungju Lee. Each of them will speak for about 25 minutes. They will then comment on each other's presentations, followed by Q&A with all of you. Today we have Korean, French, Spanish, and English translation. You can select your language at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion. In the next few days, we will post on our website, peoplesacademy.net, the faculty presentations in Korean, English, French, and Spanish, along with PowerPoints and links to relevant articles. The Korean Peninsula was partitioned at the end of World War II into the north as a Soviet occupation zone and the south as a U.S. occupation zone. This division remains a notable symbol of the Cold War. Although the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 ended with an armistice, there was no peace agreement, and the Korean conflict is ongoing. The UN command remains in South Korea, and U.S. military bases there have been fortified. This seminar will focus on international law issues related to the Korean War and ongoing post-armistice conflicts, the UN command in South Korea, and the military alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. These are not just historical events, but continue to cast the shadow of U.S. imperialism over the Korean Peninsula and Asia to this day. Since the armistice, the U.S. has remained as the UN command. The U.S. and South Korea have concluded a mutual defense treaty, and they continue to conduct joint military exercises, and South Korea has maintained mandatory military conscription. Many people in Korea have struggled against mandatory military service, invoking the right to conscientious objection and protesting aggressive war. The UN Charter, General Assembly resolutions, and the UN flag are key tools for understanding U.S. imperialism in Korea. We will examine the situation on the Korean Peninsula from the perspective of international human rights law and the right to peace. So I will now introduce all of our faculty, and then they will deliver their presentations. Professor Peter Kuznick is Professor of History and Director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, and a member of the Global Studies faculty at the University of Salamanca. He served 5 three-year terms as Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. Professor Kuznick and filmmaker Oliver Stone co-authored the 12-part Showtime documentary film series and book, both titled The Untold History of the United States. Professor Kuznick is author of Beyond the Laboratory: Scientists as Political Activists in 1930s America. He is co-author with former Japanese Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama, Oliver Stone, and Akira Kimura of The Untold Post-War History of the United States and Japan. He is co-author with Akira Kimura of Rethinking the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki Japanese and American Perspectives. And he is co-author with Yuki Tanaka of Nuclear Power and Hiroshima, The Truth Behind the Peaceful Use of Nuclear Power. Professor Kuznick co-founded the Committee for a National Discussion of Nuclear History and Current Policy and the Nuclear Education Project with Hiroshima Mayor Tadatoshi Akiba and Professors Mark Selden and John Dower. Professor Kuznick regularly delivers commentary for all major U.S. and international media, providing more than 300 television, documentary, and print interviews per year. He nominated Nihon Hidankyo for the Nobel Peace Prize and attended the award ceremony in Oslo as a member of the Hidankyo delegation in December 2024. Professor Kuznick will discuss how South Korea undergirds U.S. containment of China. Next, we have Professor Zhang-Hee Lee, who is emeritus professor at the Law School of Hankook University in Seoul, Korea. He received his BA in law at the Korea University, his MA at Seoul National University, and his PhD at the University of Kiel, West Germany. Professor Lee held the positions of Research Fellow at the East-West Center in Hawaii, visiting scholar at Yale Law School in the U.S., and visiting professor at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Germany. He has taught international human rights law, international organization law, and the law of armed conflict as a full professor in the law school. His administrative positions at the university include Dean of the College of Law and Vice President of External Affairs. Professor Lee was legal advisor for the Korean Red Cross, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Ministry of Unification. He was president of the Korean Society of International Law and president of the Korean branch of the International Law Association. He is a member of the editorial board and was editor-in-chief of the Korean Yearbook of International Law and the Korean branch of ILA's English Journal. On behalf of the Republic of Korea, Professor Lee served as judge on the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. He specializes in issues involving armed conflict, the use of force, human rights, and international humanitarian law. Professor Lee will address the illegality of the U.S.-South Korea military alliance. Next, we have Mr. Lee Si-woo, who is a photojournalist and an expert on the United Nations Command, the UNC, and the UN flag. Through his work, he has learned that the problems surrounding the DMZ and the civilian control line historically stem from the Eurasian continent's geopolitical problems and structurally from the UNC, in essence, the U.S. Armed Forces. Mr. Lee notes that even though one cannot see any UNC soldier guarding the sentry post in the DMZ, the administrative authority over the DMZ lies with the UNC. In addition, the UNC has a 7th rear base in Japan. The UNC was created to fight the Korean War pursuant to a UN Security Council resolution, but the command lies with the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, not with the UN Military Staff Committee. For these reasons, in 1975, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to disband the UNC, but the U.S. has not yet complied with that resolution. Mr. Lee published an essay book called Civil Control Line Peace Tour. In addition to Korean, this book has been translated into German and English. He has also published several other photographic essay books about the DMZ, the UNC, the unfinished Korean War, and anti-personnel landmines. Finland Public Management TV televised Mr. Lee's story in a documentary called The Land of Iron. He was an invited artist for a solo exhibition at the 1999 Hague Peace Appeal, and he presented a lecture for the Nobel Peace Prize International Campaign to Ban Landmines in Washington, D.C. Mr. Lee will discuss the illegality of the UN command and the use of the UN flag. And finally, we have Professor Kyung-Jo Lee. He has been a professor at the Inha University School of Law in Korea since 2000. He served as Dean of the Law School at Inha University from 2021 to 2023 and Dean of the Legal Research Center at Inha University from 2010 to 2012 and 2013 to 2014. Professor Lee studied at Korean University in Korea from 1984 to 1988, and he received his PhD in constitutional law at Hitotsubachi University in Japan from 1992 to 1997. He was a visiting scholar at Ritsumeikan University in Japan in 2016, a visiting scholar at the University of California at Berkeley in the U.S. in 2008, and a visiting scholar at DAAD in Germany in 2004. He has been an executive member of the Center for Peace and Disarmament of PSPD since 2005. Professor Lee will address conscientious objection in Korea. So, Professor Kuznick, go ahead.
Thanks, Marjorie, for all those introductions. Let me start with two caveats. First, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a historian. And second, I'm not an expert on Korea. My field is really nuclear history, but I've been writing a lot about US war plans with China. I guess a third caveat would be when I woke up this morning, my talk was about 2 hours long. So I've been desperately trying to cut it as I go, but it's still much too long, so I'll cut it on the fly. So to get ready for this talk, I've been trying to understand how South Korea fits into those plans. But please feel free to correct me if I get something wrong. I'd like to start with the Korean War. Koreans know a lot about the Korean War, especially North Koreans. Americans know next to nothing about it. In the US, it's often referred to as the Forgotten War. By that, we mean that it is even more forgotten than America's other wars, which means it is very forgotten. Zhou Enlai once said, the charming thing about Americans is they have absolutely no historical memory. And as a professor of history, I know that that's true. On June 24th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and the Cold War suddenly turned red hot. Nestled between Japan, China, and the Soviet Union, Korea had long been a point of contention among those three Asian powers. Japan had occupied and ruled Korea from 1910 to 1945, but Japanese conquest goes back to the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876. As Marjorie said, toward the end of the Pacific War in August of 45, Korea was divided into a Soviet zone north of the 38th parallel and a US zone to the south. Drawn up hastily by Colonel Dean Rusk the day after Nagasaki was bombed, the arrangement was meant as a temporary one until unification and independence could be restored. In the north, the Soviets installed General Kim Il-sung, who had led guerrilla forces against the Japanese in Manchuria during the war. The Americans installed Syngman Rhee in the south. Border skirmishes occurred frequently. The Joint Chiefs had warned repeatedly against getting drawn into a war in Korea, a place of little strategic importance bordering on the Soviet Union and China. And the Joint Chiefs recommended that it be excluded from the US defense perimeter. Secretary of State Acheson also excluded Korea in an important speech in January 1950. The Joint Chiefs cautioned that excluding the Soviets from the peace treaty with Japan might provoke a Soviet attack on Japan. They struck instead through proxies in Korea. Rhee's repressive policies and economic blunders made him a very unpopular figure in the South. Under U.S. pressure, he had allowed elections to proceed in 1950. His supporters received a thrashing at the polls. Despite the setback, he had continued to discuss plans to militarily unify Korea under his own command in the coming months. Kim, too, spoke of reunification. Believing that a South Korean attack on the North was coming, Stalin decided to act first. Truman was in Missouri when word of the North Korean invasion reached him. Immediately concluding that the attack represented a new stage of communist aggression, he decided that the U.S. must respond militarily. The New York Times urged Truman to act decisively or risk, quote, losing half a world. Acting decisively would also silence the Republicans who blamed Truman for losing China. He quickly pushed through a resolution through the United Nations Security Council, which the Soviets had been boycotting over its refusal to seat Communist China. Although it was nominally a UN effort, the United States provided half the ground forces and almost all of the naval and air power. Most of the other ground forces came from South Korea. Truman also opted to bypass congressional authorization, setting the stage for a policy that will continue till today. In the memo he wrote a month before the attack, John Forster Dulles pessimistically surveyed the declining U.S. strategic position globally. You have to remember that in August of 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, and also in 1949, the communists defeated the Kuomintang and took control of China. But Dulles offered a glimmer of hope. The series of disasters, he wrote, can probably be prevented if at some doubtful point we quickly take a dramatic and strong stand that shows our confidence and resolution. Probably this series of disasters cannot be prevented any other way. The U.S. would take that stand in Korea. Truman told congressional leaders, quote, if we let Korea down, the Soviet will keep right on going and swallow up one piece of Asia after another, which we hear about Putin today. Same logic. We had to make a stand sometime, Truman said, or else let all of Asia go by the board. If we were to let Asia go, the Near East would collapse, and no telling what would happen in Europe. Therefore, I've ordered our forces to support Korea. The communist victory in China had raised the stakes. Having lost the China market, Japan now looked to Korea and Southeast Asia, where conditions were also volatile. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's communist-led forces were challenging French rule. A powerful insurgent movement was competing for power in the Philippines. British colonial interests were under attack in Malaya. More than 100,000 Soviet-trained and equipped North Korean troops overwhelmed the U.S. and South Korean forces, pinning them down around Busan. Facing defeat, General MacArthur requested and received permission to push past the 38th parallel and liberate the North. He staged a surprise amphibious landing of 17,000 men in Incheon in September. MacArthur assured Truman that the Chinese would not enter the fight, but agreed to use only Korean troops as he moved toward the Chinese border. He even spoke about fighting ending by Thanksgiving and having the troops out by Christmas. He dismissed repeated warnings by Zhou Enlai that the Chinese would enter the war if the U.S. persisted in its advance northward. The Chinese were also incensed over the U.S.-led campaign to deny them UN representation and the U.S. decision to defend Formosa Taiwan with the Seventh Fleet. Stalin had earlier told Kim that launching the war was a way to get back at, quote, the dishonest, perfidious, and arrogant behavior of the United States in Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, and especially its decision to form NATO. MacArthur blithely disregarded his agreement to use only Korean troops and ordered the Air Force to bomb near the Chinese border. When the Joint Chiefs tried to restrain him, he accused them of appeasement like at Munich and said to give up any part of North Korea to the aggression of the Chinese communists would be the greatest defeat of the free world in recent times. Truman and the Joint Chiefs caved to MacArthur's demands. On November 24th, MacArthur launched the major offensive he believed would end the war. But suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops streamed across the Yalu River, sending the US and Allied troops into a frantic retreat. The setback was devastating. MacArthur solemnly announced that, quote, we face an entirely new war. Atchison told Congress that the U.S. was on the brink of World War III. Truman agreed. It looks like World War III is here, he wrote in his diary. General Omar Bradley called it, quote, the greatest military disaster in the history of the United States. Time magazine reported it was the worst defeat the U.S. had ever suffered. U.S. leaders decided to lay waste to Korea. At the start of the war, MacArthur and others had advocating using atomic bombs in support of combat operations, but experts said Korea's cities were too small. But Chinese entry changed that calculation. Truman stunned the press corps in late November 1950 by announcing that all options, explicitly including atomic devastation, were on the table. Elected officials concurred. Representative Mendel Rivers of South Carolina declared, if there was ever a time to use the A-bomb, it is now. Senator Owen Brewster from Maine proposed using it against the Chinese. Representative Tom Steed of Oklahoma preferred the Kremlin. Representative Joseph Bryson of South Carolina just wanted to make sure it was dropped on somebody. He said the hour was at hand when every known force, including the atomic bomb, should be promptly utilized. Gallup found that 52 to 38% the public supported using atomic bombs. UN delegates warned, however, that the Asian people would be horrified by such use. And Attlee rushed across the Atlantic from Britain to tell Truman that the Europeans shared that horror. On December 9, 1950, MacArthur requested authorization to use atomic bombs at his discretion. On December 24th, he submitted a list of 26 targets. With U.S. and South Korean casualties mounting, MacArthur began issuing statements from Tokyo, blaming others for the military debacle and pushing for all-out war with China. On March 24th, 1951, knowing that Truman was pressing for a ceasefire, MacArthur broadcast his own ultimatum to China. Truman bristled, I'll show that son of a bitch who's boss, but he let the incident slide. But when Republican Congressman Joe Martin read to the entire House of Representatives a letter that MacArthur had written in which he said, quote, if we lose this war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable, the Joint Chiefs unanimously recommended that MacArthur be relieved of his command. On April 11th, the White House announced MacArthur's firing. MacArthur's eagerness to use atomic weapons did not factor into this decision. Just the week before, the Joint Chiefs had ordered atomic attacks on Manchurian bases if the Chinese sent another large contingent of forces. On April 6, Truman had approved that order and authorized the transfer of 9 atomic weapons from the AEC to military custody on Guam and Okinawa. Firing MacArthur proved calamitous for Truman, whose approval rating sank to a record low of 22%. Seldom, quote, Time magazine noted, seldom has a more unpopular man fired a more popular one. Republican leaders in the House and Senate met to discuss impeachment. The public sided with MacArthur. 7.5 million spectators cheered him at a New York parade. He received a hero's welcome in Washington, Boston, San Francisco, and Chicago. He defended his conduct on the war before a joint session of Congress and bade an emotional farewell. The address was broadcast live on national radio. Quote, we saw a great hunk of God in the flesh, and we heard the voice of God, gushed Congressman Dewey Short of Missouri. Truman, however, chided, quote, the damn fool congressman crying like a bunch of women over nothing but a bunch of bullshit. MacArthur was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, who immediately requested 38 atomic bombs in May of 1951. But that spring and summer, with Stalin's help, the U.S., China, and the two Koreas began negotiations, which dragged on for 2 years. The U.S. air war continued unabated. unleashing a firebombing campaign similar to the one the US had visited upon Japan 5 years earlier. Now the weapon of choice was napalm. Almost every major city in Korea was burned to the ground. Survivors sought shelter in caves. South Koreans fared little better than did North Koreans. Uh, the British Armed Forces Yearbook reported for 1951, quote, "The war was fought without regard for South Koreans, and their unfortunate country was regarded as an arena rather than a country to be liberated. As a consequence, fighting was ruthless, and it is no exaggeration to state that South Korea no longer exists as a country. Its towns have been destroyed, much of its means of livelihood eradicated, and its people reduced to a sullen mass dependent on charity. The South
Professor
Koreans,
Kuznick, could you just slow down a bit for the interpreters? Just a
okay,
little bit. Thank you.
I'm just desperate to try to cover as much as possible. Uh, its towns have been destroyed, much of its means of livelihood eradicated, and its people reduced to a sullen mass dependent on charity. The South Koreans, unfortunately, was regarded as a gook like his cousins north of the 38th parallel. Casualty estimates vary widely, but approximately 3 to 4 million Koreans died out of a total population of 30 million, as did more than a million Chinese and 54,000 Americans. By February 1951, only 39% of Americans still supported the war. It ended in a stalemate. Americans wondered how their powerful modern military could fail to defeat an ill-equipped army of Korean and Chinese peasants. The Korean War paved the way for the dramatic remilitarization of US society. Truman approved NSC 68, and the defense budget for fiscal 1951 almost quadrupled from $13.5 billion to $48.2 billion. Within 6 months of the start of the war, US defense spending soared to $54 billion. NATO was transformed into a full-fledged military structure with the US Supreme Commander and US troops stationed in Europe. And Churchill grasped the real meaning for the United States. He said, "Korea does not really matter now. I'd never heard of the bloody place until I was 74 years old. Its importance lies in the fact that it has led to the rearming of America." And rearm the US did and continues to do so. But by 2019, the US, which had been the undisputed global hegemon since 1945, was facing challenges from both a militarily resurgent Russia and an economically resurgent China. Beginning the previous year, the US national security strategy recognized that the primary challenge to US global leadership no longer came from an ill-conceived and greatly inflated global terrorist threat, but from Russia and China, with China, because of its economic prowess, viewed as the pacing threat. US Secretary of War, I mean Defense, no, I mean War, Pete Hegseth, the former Fox News anchor with right-wing and Christian nationalist tattoos covering much of his body, said early on we should end the war in Ukraine so we could focus on the real enemy, China. Trump has long been wary of China and the challenge it could one day pose to US hegemony. In his 2000 ghost-written book, The War We Deserve, he branded China our biggest long-term challenge. The same attitude was held by Obama and Biden. Americans have been obsessed with the China market since the late 19th century, and the Pacific has gained ever greater salience in the 21st century. The US has fought major wars in Eastern, Northeast, Southeast, Central, and Southwest China between 1941 and 2019. But the focus has shifted increasingly eastward since the Obama administration announcement of its Asia pivot in 2011. Obama talk of a pivot to Asia and away from the Middle East where the US had been bogged down in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, and to some extent Europe, began with Hillary Clinton's October 11th, 2011 article in Foreign Policy magazine titled presumptuously, America's Pacific Century. Recognizing the growing challenge of China, she wrote, presumably with a straight face, quote, the region is eager for our leadership and our business, perhaps more so than any time in modern history. We're the only power with a network of strong alliances in the region, no territorial ambitions, and a long record of providing for the common good, unquote. As if on cue, other members of the administration began referencing the Clinton piece and stressing the same things. Trump came to office in 2017 with a stable of China hawks and initiated a trade war with China. By November of 2018, he had imposed tariffs of $250 billion of Chinese imports with the rate of 25% and sometimes higher. He threatened to extend that tariff to all Chinese imports, amounting to additional $267 billion. Many hoped that Biden would quickly reset relations with China, given how friendly he had been with China earlier in his career. But instead of reversing course, Biden doubled down on Trump's hostility. Biden came to office with 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security, a hotbed of Democratic China hawks who were as bellicose as the Trump appointees. He wasted little time in inviting Taiwan's top diplomat in the US to his inauguration. He then integrated Taiwan into his broader Indo-Pacific strategy designed to contain China and increase the number of US military personnel on the island. Under Biden, relations got so bad that many feared a war was imminent. He bolstered US Pacific alliances, something that the alliance hostile Trump had neglected. He breathed new life into the moribund Quad, an anti-China security alliance of Japan, Australia, India, and the US. Under Biden, the US constructed new bases in the Philippines. It formed AUKUS with Australia and Britain and JACUS with Japan and South Korea. Despite this, Trump excoriated Biden for being soft on China and called Xi Jinping a thug. The United States was extremely concerned about the rapidity of China's economic growth, and especially the appeal of its Belt and Road Initiative. In 2010, China surpassed Japan as the world's second largest economy. Goldman Sachs chief economist gauged that China was on track to overtake the US as the largest economy by 2027. China's military had also been expanding. It now has the biggest navy in the world, but the US fleet is almost twice as heavy as the Chinese fleet. China also has the largest standing army in the world, with 2 million active personnel and about 400,000 new recruits. But it's important to remember that the minimum that is demanded of all NATO members had been 2%, and now it's 5%. And Rutte and others are talking about 10% that the NATO members have to spend of their GDP on their militaries. China
Professor, it's
officially
a 5-minute warning, sorry.
China
I'm sorry.
officially, I'm about a third of the way through. China officially spends 1.7% of its GDP on its military. There's some place the real figure at a bit above 2%. But it's the threat to invade Taiwan, which Admiral Philip Davidson has said that China plans to invade Taiwan by 2027. Xi Jinping said that's nonsense. They have no such plans. But Biden has said on 4 separate occasions that if China does invade Taiwan, that the US is going to get involved militarily, even though the US has had to walk that back every time he said that. And there's no certainty that the US would prevail. In fact, the Pentagon has run 18 war games over a war between US and China over Taiwan, and China has prevailed in all 18. But it's not just Davidson who talks about that. We've also got General Mike Minihan, who says he thinks the US and China will be at war by 2025. He said that in 2023. On top of that, on August 20th of last year, we had two incredible articles come out. One is by David Sanger, the chief security analyst in the New York Times, who said that the United States is preparing for a three-front nuclear war simultaneously against uh, Russia, China, and North Korea. That same day, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had an article saying that there are nuclear planners in the United States who believe that the U.S. can prevail against, not only prevail, but that the U.S. can preemptively attack Russia and China and knock out the submarines with because of the new advances in technology, with making it impossible for Russia and China to even retaliate against the United States. This is the kind of madness that's being proposed. And this school of thought is growing. Admiral Thomas Buchanan last year said the U.S. can win a nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea, but it must still maintain enough nuclear weapons to maintain its hegemony afterwards. If I had time, I was going to talk about the origins of this war thinking against China. And I was going to talk about Andrew Krabinovich. And I was going to talk about Arthur Marshall. And I was going to talk about Pillsbury, who's Trump's favorite, that these people have been planning for a war with China ever since the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. They're the ones who have established the air-sea battle plan, which calls for effectively a preemptive attack on China, a massive attack that would create a war that they believe the United States can win. Uh, the Chinese have been accusing the U.S. of being dangerous warmongers for years. And I have a lot of great quotes that I won't have time to read. But I do want to get to the question of the involvement of South Korea and U.S. war plans for South Korea. Uh, the Krapinovich described a set of bilateral alliances and partnerships based on what he called hub and spoke relationships, with Washington as the hub and Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand as the spokes. He thinks it's likely that South Korea, Japan, and Australia will come to U.S. aid over Taiwan, and that Russia might come to help China. Of these U.S. proxies, South Korea has the biggest military force with 500,000 active troops and 3.1 million reservists. Yoon's recent impeachment and ouster from office may have thrown a slight wrench into U.S. plans, but President Lee's election in June of 25 will not fundamentally change things. Key to the U.S. plans to defend Taiwan, as Krapinovich noted, would be deploying troops from Japan, South Korea, and Australia before U.S. forces could arrive. China is less than 100 miles away from Taiwan. U.S. forces are 5,000 miles away. So going back to the 1953 U.S.-Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. has command authority over South Korean military in the event of war. So South Korean involvement is a given. U.S. OPCON, as it's called, was supposed to end in 2012 and 2015 with the transfer of control back to South Korea, but that's been postponed. President Lee has again made that a priority, but offered a 5-year roadmap that would postpone the transfer back to South Korea until 2030. South Korea has gotten peacetime OPCON since 1994, but Japan has maintained this position of strategic ambiguity, as has Australia. Last year, in an article in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, Lieutenant Austin Sutton wrote, quote, recent war games show the United States will be hard-pressed to win a conflict over Taiwan without Japan's support. But he warns that even if Japanese officials want to intervene alongside the U.S., quote, it's not clear the Japanese public would permit it. Only a dismal 15% support fighting along U.S. forces, he wrote. So the war games have been going on. talisman saber recently with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the US, and 15 other countries. South Korea figures prominently in US Pacific war plans. In June of 2014, the Korean Herald newspaper quoted Lieutenant General Jean-Marc Jauss, the US 7th Air Force commander and deputy commander of UN Command Korea, as confirming, quote, certainly we apply air-sea battle, not just here in Korea, but across all our armed forces, everywhere that we go. But he explained air-sea battle is sometimes confused because it says air and sea. The truth is, it's a concept that applies to all our forces, whether they're air, land, sea, space, or cyber. And what it does is ensure our capabilities are well meshed, our requirements are identified and procured and acquired in a manner we can all benefit from. So it comes down to joint warfighting at its most elemental. And he said, I think when he's asked about Korean capabilities, he said, I think the armed forces of Korea, and whether you're talking about the Air Force or the Navy or the Marine Corps or the Army, have tremendous capabilities now, and they're always improving. I've just mentioned a few that the Korean Air Force has brought online. But you can see the new cruisers that the Navy is buying, new capabilities for the Army. So I think they're on a good path toward a stronger fighting force because they're already very, very capable. And what I'd like to see also is how they're becoming more joint. Will become more joint, more interoperable. The fact we now have a naval officer, an admiral that is chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Korean Chiefs of Staff, our exercises and others stress joint warfighting. And I think that's a great capability that will continue to develop.
Professor, we're going to have to leave it there, and maybe you can bring up some of the things that you didn't have time to cover in the discussion.
Okay,
Okay.
including the recent meeting between Lee and Trump.
Okay. Do you want to talk about that in just a couple minutes, or would you rather save that for the
No,
discussion?
I'll save that. I'll save it.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, you'll save it. Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much for explaining how U.S. anti-communism has animated a very dangerous policy, including nearly using nuclear weapons again, and also for providing a historical context for the U.S. anti-China policy and the role of South Korea, and of course, frightening us to death. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. That was great. Okay, next we have Professor Zhang-He Lee. Professor?
Thank you. Could you please hear me? Thank you. Could you please hear me? Dean Mazoria?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. So good morning. Good morning. And especially I owe the great debt of the gratitude to organizer, Mr. President Jun Sasamoto and the organizing committee, Dean Mazoria. Thank you so much. Yeah. Inviting me to this wonderful conference. So my topic, as you know, the exit strategies for the illegality of the ROK and US militarized. So now, you know, in Korea, it happened to be South Korea, US, Japan, freedom exercise. It is happening. US focus shift from the North Korea containment to China, containment to US military announced the imminent launch of the trilateral multi-domain military exercise. It's called Freedom Edge, stating it demonstrates strengthening deterrence with the first island chain. By mentioning the first island chain, the front line of the defense against China's expansion into the Pacific, US, South Korea, Japan, joint military exercise, clearly emphasized its purpose as check on China. However, it made no mention of North Korea. Analysts are suggesting the United States, which is demanding alliance modernization, is shifting the focus of the ROK, US, Japan, security cooperation from the North Korea to containing China. US Indo-Pacific Command announced plans for Freedom Edge, a multi-domain military exercise conducted by ROK US Japan, stating that the purpose of the exercise is to further strengthen deterrence in the Asia-Pacific region within the first island China, the first island chain. The first island chain is a maritime defense network established by the US during the New Cold War to block China's Pacific expansion. China considers breaching this line a top priority in its maritime strategy. The US military inclusion of the first island chain in official document is interpreted as a clear indication the global of the ROK US Japan military cooperation is not to deter North Korea but to the China. I emphasize abolish this military exercise immediately. This is my point. Today, I would like to say the illegality of the ROK US military alliance.
Professor, which slide are you
Actually,
on? Professor Lee,
actually,
excuse me.
yes,
Yes, can you tell me which slide you're on so that we can make sure that we're showing the correct one?
now I am beginning the first slide, yeah?
You're still on the first slide. Oh,
Yes,
okay,
yeah,
and
actually, number one, the alliance is a potential war community based on the military concept. As long as the alliance exists, weapons procurement and support, military exercise, and operational training for war preparation are carried out continuously and aggressively. It is changing the the outbreak of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950. Second, 1954 signing of the ROK US Mutual Defense Treaty. Third, after Chinese GDP surpassed Japan's in 2010. Now, September 2025, US forces in Korea's role in containing China would be expanded to include tens of the Pacific region. So this kind of the alliance violence of the people's right to environment, Korean Constitution, Article 35. Yes, yes. The issues with the elected ROK US military lines. The big number two. First, structural problems. Main structural problems, dependence, inequality, and violence of the South Korea independent military sovereignty. And violation of the nation's military sovereignty. This is a key word. Violation of the territorial sovereignty of the Republic of Korea, Article 66 of the Constitution. Next, the violation of the people's right to purpose happiness. Article 10 stipulates in the ROK Constitution. Annual ROK US-Japan joint military exercise violated the ROK Constitution's policy of a peaceful unification. Article 4 of the Constitution, and significantly provoke North Korea military. You know the ROK US military lines violate Article 60 of the Armistice Agreement. So the violated constitutional, but also the international law. Number 7. Number 7, the introduction of the weapons. Annual military exercise war preparation. ROK US military lines violated Article 60 of the Armistice Agreement. Armistice Agreement. Article 60 Armistice Agreement say for the peaceful settlement of the Korean questions, the military commanders of the both sides shall consult on the withdrawal all foreign forces from Korea and the peaceful settlement of the Korean questions. U.S. installing THAAD system, Seongju, Soseongni, Seongju County. Site confirmed April 2017. U.S. nuclear missile force to contain China. At the time, China strongly opposed the deployment of THAAD. And ACE, the Humphrey U.S. military base in Pyeongtaek military base. There are so many problems. Mainly, noise pollution could impact residents. Second, a target for China's tactical nuclear strike in the event of the Chinese emergency. Quite recently, the US government and the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs say so-called alliance modernization. Alliance modernization. It means a risk of the entangling US forces in Korea and implicated in international regional conflict outside of Korea, including ROK military. Alliance modernization enhances the strategic flexibility of the Japan self-defense forces, enabling them to enter the Korean Peninsula in the event of the Korean crisis, along with the rear unit of the UN command in Japan. The number big three issues of the with the ROK US Mutual Defense Treaty, 1954. This is the key legal inequality treaty, 1954. This treaty says legal foundation of the ROK-US military alliance, recognition of the right to station troops without the compensation, especially Article 4 of the treaty. Korea grant the US the right to deploy troops within and outside Korean territory without the compensation. South Korea does not temporarily use US military base and the facilities to the United States, but grant them the right to deploy them at any time and without restriction from them on. The United States has the right to deploy US nuclear weapons anywhere on South Korea territory at any time without the South Korean permission. The Ministry of National Defense asserts the Ministry of National Defense. This is Korean. The Ministry of National Defense asserts the U.S. deployment of the SAD in Seongju does not require the ratification of the South Korea National Assembly. So I could say Koreans have no right to military sovereignty. So I would like to emphasize the third, the exercise of strategic flexibility. 2006 violated Article 3 of the ROK-US Mutual Defense Treaty. US military strategy is to allow US forces stationed in Korea to operate freely regardless of the global security situation rather than being confined to the specific reason. Specifically, the US seeks to utilize US forces in Korea for its containment of China and its Indo-Pacific strategy. This undermines South Korea's security and sovereignty. Therefore, Article 3 of the Mutual Defense Treaty strictly limits its scope and trigger condition to the defense of the South Korea in accordance with the U.S. Senate. Yeah. in accordance with the U.S. Senate understanding, exchange of the protocol. So, alliance modernization, this is a big security issue now in South Korea. Alliance modernization, we need alliance modernization revision of the ROK-US SOFA. It is urgently necessary as an institutional control mechanism. I would recommend alliance modernization must be changed. How? How? Amendment of the ROK-US SOFA require prior consultation with the host country, South Korea, regarding the conversion of the US forces and overseas deployment. SOFA agreement with the US, including the Philippines and Germany and Spain, all stipulate this. And I would recommend establishing North Korea as a multi-peace conference involving four parties: North Korea and South Korea, United States, and China, in addition to the bilateral ROK-US alliance. 6. Abolishment of the Washington Resolution 1953. This word is very strange to the general people, but it is very, very important for international law based of me. The 16 participating countries of the UN Command UNC automatically intervene in the event of the occurrence of armed conflict on the Korean Peninsula without a UN Security Council resolution, repealing the Washington Declaration, so-called the Washington Declaration 1953. The same time in Korean armistice agreement. At the same time in Washington Resolution Declaration. This violated the UN Charter and armistice agreement. Furthermore, the entry of the foreign troops into South Korea violated Article 16, paragraph 2 of the Korean Constitution. It must be ratified Korean Assembly. Now it was not possible. So, 7. The suspension of the annual ROK-US joint military exercise. I emphasized many times the suspension of the annual ROK-US joint military exercise. This is a significant preemptive measures build military trust between two Koreas. This will force the military tension between two Koreas. 8. Transform into comprehensive strategy lines. I would suggest the ROK-US alliance must transform from military centric lines into a comprehensive strategy alliance encompassing diverse areas of cooperation, including economic, supply chain, and semiconductors. Now the alliance is too much focused on the military point. It should be more comprehensive transport. This is my saying. Ninth, balanced diplomacy and the multi-diplomacy of a Korean diplomacy. The ROK-US Center diplomacy must be expanded to include ROK China, ROK Russia, ROK Middle East, and ROK BRICS, a peaceful diplomatic relationship centered on national interest based on the balanced diplomacy and the multilateral diplomacy. Census support North Korea for establishment of the diplomatic relations with the US and Japan. The leaders to support North Korea's responsible activity in the national community through the establishment of the diplomatic relation between the US and North Korea and between North Korea and Japan. 11th, to prepare for the gradual transition of the 1953 Korean Peace Agreement to peace treaty. A collaborative working level consultative body, South Korea, North Korea, US, and China, is needed to transform the name of the United Nations commander, the South Korean signatory to the Peace Agreement, and its function to the Republic of Korea. In conclusion, general conclusion, first, the bilateral ROK-US military alliance originated in the Korean War on June 25, 1915, is gradually becoming unequal, now moving beyond its deterrence function, and is now entangled in US-led international conflict outside of Korea, putting the ROK military at risk of being interrogated. Second one, the pressure from the United States to provide artillery support to Ukraine during the Russia-Ukraine war is illegal. The provision of the lethal weapons remains uncertain, but U.S. indirect encouragement of the participation in a third international conflict and its support of the weapons constitutes violation of the Korean Peace Agreement and the Korean Constitution. Second, two, above pressure from the United States to provide artillery support to Ukraine during the Russia-Ukraine war is a clear violation of the Korean Peace Agreement, Article 62, and the UN Charter, Article 33, peaceful settlement of the international dispute. So, Korean government must know to USA strategic flexibility and alliance modernization. Almost the Korean opinion leader against this strategic flexibility and alliance modernization.
Professor Lee, you have about 5 more minutes.
In Korea,
Professor?
Okay, China, and
Professor?
pursue its Pacific hegemony.
Professor?
Using cunning terminology like strategic flexibility and alliance modernization. The
Professor?
problem is a significant burden for South Korea,
Hello,
which must
Professor?
strive for peace on the Korean Peninsula and
Professor?
overcome the division of North and South Korea.
Professor, you have about
Yes, I
5
know.
more minutes, about 5 more minutes.
Fourth, the ROK US lines is illegal. The ROK US lines founded on the ROK US Military Defense Treaty 1954 against the illegal acts that violated the armistice agreement, constitution, and international law. Fifth, the rectification of the subordinate ROK US lines and the exercise of independent military sovereignty. This year is the 18th anniversary of the Korean national liberation. What is the real meaning of the 28th anniversary of national liberation? I would ask the USA and international community. A 28th annual anniversary of the national liberation was to begin with the rectification of the subordinate ROK-US line and the exercise of independent military sovereignty. To this end, a government level Korean government level task force team was to be established to meticulously prepare for the revision of the 1954 ROK-US Mutual Defense Treaty and the notification of the US exercise of wartime operational control of the South Korea. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang-Hee Lee, for your great presentation detailing how the ROK-US military alliance violates the ROK Constitution and for explaining the one-sided mutual, in quotes, defense treaty that allows the US to deploy nuclear weapons without South Korean consent, and for explaining how this alliance should be transformed and a peace treaty with North Korea should be concluded. Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Lee Si-woo. Mr. Lee Si-woo, are you ready?
Yes, thank you for your trouble. My name is Ishu. I'm photographer. My post subject is DMZ, demilitarization, US forces in Korea, US forces in Japan, US forces in Germany, and United Nations Command. South Korea still maintains the national security law, which is designed to control political dissent. Because of my work on US military bases and national security law for secretly disclosing military secrets and praising and encouraging North Korea. The argument was that criticizing the UN command was unique to North Korea. However, I won a decisive victory in court, and since then, discussion of the UN command has been legalized in South Korea. As a result, an organization called the International Campaign to Abolish the Fake UN Command was formed and Professor Lee Jang-hee, one of today's speakers, is its representative. Today, I will discuss the illegality of the UN command and, in particular, explain the significant achievements we have made in the movement to ban the use of the UN flag by the UN command. And explain first, UNC is not an organ of the UN. The Security Council Resolution 84, July 1950, recommended all UN members providing military forces make such forces available to a US-led unified command. This was the result of the United States' rejection of the proposal of the then UN Secretary General Taeguk Lee and others to establish the new military command as a subsidiary body of the UN. Moreover, the recommendation in the Article 39 of the United Nations Charter has been inappropriate from all the time of the UN Charter to limit its use only for a peaceful resolution of conflict listed in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. Thus, the US drafted SCR 84 was adopted in violation of the Article 39 by recommending military aid to the Republic of Korea to the UN member states. Therefore, the recommendation for the creation of the unified command was neither legal nor a UN entity. However, the Truman administration unilaterally changed the name of the unified command to UN Command on July 25, 1950. Because of this, it was misunderstood by many people as if the UNC was a UN entity. On June 16, 1994, the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs provided its legal analysis on the UN command. Clearly, the Security Council did not establish the Unified Command as a subsidiary organ under its control. Therefore, the creation and dissolution of such command does not fall within the responsibility of any United Nations organ, such as the Security Council, but rather within that of the United States government. There was no United Nations involvement in the conduct of military operations and no United Nations budget for the unified command. Let me explain the second, theft of the UN name by the US UN command. Let me skip some part. As for the name of the United Nations command itself, it was officially established as a separate military command in Tokyo on July 25, 1940, in the name of General MacArthur. The first report of the UC to the SC described the multinational forces fighting in Korea as the United Nations forces as well as Unified Command forces. And from the second report, officially use the name United Nations Command. The use of United Nations Command name was nothing more than a deliberate abuse of the UN name. On November 29, 1966, the U.S. Embassy in Korea reported to the U.S. Department of State that it was illegal for the U.S. to use the name UNC and discussed countermeasures against it. We should also be aware that the UN resolution called only for a unified command and phrase United Nations command does not appear in any UN resolutions. UNC appears to have been adopted at the beginning of the Korean War as a name for the unified command, solely as a unilateral action by the US, and though unchallenged over the years, is nevertheless without UN sanction. In this era of UN peacekeeping forces in various parts of the world, the US is an anomaly in terms of its relationships to the UN. Now that hostilities have been over for certain years, the Soviet could argue that the pattern established for other UN peacekeeping forces in their relationships with the UN should be followed, where UNC should be stripped of its UN clock. The above text shows that the United States was also fully aware that the use of the name UN Command was a violation of Secret Council Resolution 84. In June 1994, the UN Office of Legal Affairs issued the following clear legal analysis of the use of the name UNC. The so-called United Nations Command is a misnomer. As such, the abuse of the UN name by UNC's violation of UN Security Council Resolution 84. Let me explain. Third, a legal use of the UN flag by the UN command. On October 20, 1947, the UN General Assembly, by Resolution 167, authorized the UN Secretary General to create a UN flag code. Accordingly, on December 19, 1947, Secretary General Craig Lee drafted and issued the flag code. Article 8 of the code states that the flag shall not be used except in accordance with this flag code. But the Security Council authorized the unified command under the Security Council Resolution 84 to use the United Nations flag at its discretion. According to UN flag code, the authority to use the UN flags was given to the UN Secretary General, not with the Security Council. Therefore, the Security Council Resolution 84 was in violation of the UN flag code. The Security Council Resolution 84 also authorized the use of the UN flag only in the course of operation against North Korean forces concurrently with the various nations participating. However, the UN flag code does not contain a provision authorizing the use of the flag in military operations. On 28 July 1950, Secretary General Craig Lee added to the code a new paragraph under Article 6, which stipulated that the flag may be used in military operations only upon express authorization to that expect by a competent organ of the United Nations. Professor Hans Kelsen, leading legal scholar on the Charter and Law of the United Nations, criticized this new provision as an ex post facto justification of the Secret Council Resolution 84. Furthermore, he said such authorization had no basis neither in the Charter nor in the Resolution 167 of the General Assembly. The authority to approve the use of the UN flag rests solely with the Secretary General of the United Nations. Nevertheless, the US-led UNC has been using the UN flag in Korea and Japan for 73 years now. Although the operation against North Korea forces was halted in July 1953 with the military armistice agreement. According to a joint letter sent to the Secretary General by 28 member states on 15 September 1972. They asked to add it to the agenda of the 27 sessions of the General Assembly, drop the resolution with the title of creation of favorable conditions to accelerate the independent and peaceful reunification of Korea. The second clause of the resolution stated that the General Assembly considers that the right to use the United Nations flag in South Korea should be annulled. Thereafter, the US wrote a letter to the Secret Council informing that it will undertake a measure to reduce manifestation of the United Nations command, including restrict use of the flag. About 3 months later, the US sent another letter to the Secret Council informing that from 25 August 1975, the United Nations flag will no longer fly over military installations in the Republic of Korea, except at facilities directly associated with the implementation of the armistice agreement of 27 July 1953. This was a partial admission of the US government that the UN flag had been abused by the US. However, the US is still using the UN flag today in certain US military facilities in South Korea and Japan, including 7 US military installations designated as the UNC earlier in Japan. In 1994, the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs stated the flying of the United Nations flag in the Republic of Korea is not related to any United Nations activities or programs. Let me explain. First, violations of the new UN flag code by the United Nations Command. On September 23, 2019, 46 NGOs around the world, including the International Association of the Democratic Lawyers, a non-governmental organization in consultative status with UN Economic and Social Council, and the International Campaign to Abolish the Fake United Nations Command, sent a letter to the UN Secretary General. It was a question urging action against the illegal use of United Nations flag by the UN Command. A year later, in November 2020, the amended United Nations Flag Code was published in the Secretary General's Bulletin. This was a large revision of the UN Flag Code, which had not changed since 1967. We welcome this revision of the 1967 UN Flag Code, which are quite outdated and unclear, and thanks the Secretary General for his leadership on this matter. At the same time, we would like to inform each government that there is a continuing abuse of the UN flag in violation of the new UN flag code by the UN Command, which is not a UN entity in South Korea and Japan today. Article 6.2 of the new flag code requires organizations and individuals who want to use the UN flag to meet certain conditions, including such a display of the flag does not suggest any affiliation between the United Nations and the organization displaying the flag. See Exhibit B. I request Exhibit B photo. Okay. In violation of the Article 6.2 of the new code, the UN is using the UN flag with the US and ROK flags at such places like Camp Humphreys, major US military bases where the UN's headquarters is located in Pyeongtaek. Upright picture, military guard posted in the certain parts of the DMZ, etc. While the UN's rear is up left, UN's rear is flying the UN flag with the US and Japan flags at its 7 military bases in Japan. See exhibit C. Okay. And moreover, there are Korean War memorials in over 300 locations in over 20 countries around the world, 29 of which display the UN flag or insignia. The United States is the most prominent of this. Therefore, we are deeply concerned with the extensive and flagrant violation of the new UN flag code that are taking place in South Korea, Japan, and others by the so-called UNC. If these violations are not stopped by the UN in the near future, it is most likely that they will seriously undermine the dignity and respect of United Nations in the international community.
Mr. Lee Si-woo, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay. Conclusion.
Thank you.
The revision of the UN flag code was the first significant victory of our movement. A second, even more significant victory followed. The United States has officially announced its position that the UNC is not a UN organization. Even UN Commander La Camera stated in the 2023 and 2024 US Senator and House Armed Service Committees that the UNC is a US-led multinational military organization unrelated to the UN. The Ministry of National Defense of the RK and the National Assembly Research Service have also reaffirmed this. However, rather than reducing or disbanding the UNC, it is strengthening it by recruiting more member states about the training. We are raising awareness of the UNC's illegality and violations of the UN Charter, UN Security Council resolutions, and UN law, and are persuading member states to discontinue their participation. We hope that peace activists from each country will join us in preventing their country's participations in the UN. I encourage you to cite this article and send a letter of inquiry to your country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Lee Si-woo, for explaining how the UNC was never sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, but is rather the result of unilateral U.S. action, and also for describing how the flying of the UN flag is also unauthorized by the United Nations. Thank you very much. And our last speaker, our last faculty member is Professor Kyung-Joo Lee. Professor?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning and good evening and good afternoon, everybody. This is Kyung-Joo Lee. It's a great honor to present at the People's Academy. So my presentation topic is conscientious objection to military service in Korea. So until 2020, many conscientious objectors were punished as criminals, despite the constitutional guarantee of freedom of conscience. The Alternative Service Act was implemented in Korea in 2020. So I'm going to examine the issue of conscientious objection from the perspective of right to peace. The right to peace basically focuses on disarmament and human security. So conscientious objection to military service is also an important component. So this topic is a key to tools for understanding the Korea, the Korean War, and the ongoing post-armistice conflict. In Korea, there were about 400 to 800 conscience objectors each year. The number of conscript is 300,000 in 2025, and the number of active duty soldiers is about 500,000. So conscientious objectors account for about 0.2% of those eligible for military service. So if you do not enlist or respond to call-up without a justifiable reason, you will be punished by imprisonment for not more than 3 years. So during 1973 to 2000s, 2 years in prison for disobedience by military courts. And after 2000, 1 year and 6 months in prison by civilian court. So the Constitutional Court ruled that the Military Service Act's failure to provide for alternative service was unconstitutional. The 2018, it reflects civil society's long-standing demands to recognize conscientious objection to military service. The Supreme Court has also issued a notable decision on conscientious objection to military service. The South Korea's judiciary is divided into two branches, the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. The Constitutional Court determines whether a law is unconstitutional or constitutional. And the other, the Supreme Court applies the law to determine the guilty or innocence. The Supreme Court ruled that conscientious objection to military service was a legitimate reason under the Article 88 of the Military Service Act, and thus not guilty. Alternative service. So military service in Korea is divided into active duty, reserve, and supplementary service. Alternative service was not regulated until 2020. In the case of supplementary service, they also receive 4 weeks of lifelong training. The Alternative Service Act was enacted on December 31, 2019, and came into effect on January 1st, 2020. There was a heated debate over whether this reflected the changing times or led to an increase in draft dodging. So ultimately, Korean society chose the path of preserving freedom of conscience while fulfilling its national defense obligations. The duty of national defense stipulated in Korean Constitution has been broadly interpreted to allow for exceptions, including not bearing arms. The Alternative Service Review Committee was also launched in 2020. Although there are many Ministry of National Defense officials, civil society, including NGO and professors, and participate. This photo shows the initiation ceremony of the first batch of substitutes. On the afternoon of the 26th October 2020, the first day of the implementation of the alternative service system for conscientious objectors based on religious, non-violent, or pacifist beliefs. An initiation ceremony for 63 conscientious objectors was held at the Alternative Service Education Center in Daejeon Prison. So alternative service workers' uniform, this is very similar to the uniform of prison officers. Because alternative service locations were limited to prisons. As I will discuss later, the limiting alternative service to prison is problematic. So alternative service training and a day in the life of an alternative service workers. I believe that the recognition of conscientious alternative service is a realization of the right to peace. As you know, in 1984, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution on the right to peace. This is a groundbreaking resolution in that it states that peace is a human right. The peace is not a prerequisite for a human right. Peace is human right itself. This is a groundbreaking decision. As peace is a human right, the right to peace is a third generation human right, characterized by its characteristics as a right to national protest and a right of international solidarity. It signifies that the emergence of human rights that can oppose not only state actions that conspire to start a war, but also those of foreign nations. The right to peace declaration continue in Santiago, in the Luarca, Spain, the Gwangju, Korea, and other cities. The Asian Declaration of Human Rights was announced in Gwangju in 1998, and the Chapter 4 stipulates the right to peace. As can be seen from Article 5 of the Luarca Declaration, the conscientious objection to military service is one of the key elements of the right to peace. In Korea, discussions on the right to peace have been expanding since 2000, and NGOs have also been launching campaigns utilizing the right to peace. For example, Jeju Island residents have claimed that the construction of a naval base violates the right to peace. The Jeju naval base was likely to be used by the US military. The Peace and Disarmament Center of People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, to which I belong, also participated in discussions on the right to peace at the UN Human Rights Council held in Geneva in 2012. So I met Attorney Sasamoto Japan, who is in the charge of People's Academy Office. So although the alternative service system has been introduced, there are many challenges. The government demands that the conscience be deep, certain, and true. The people who pay war games like battlegrounds possessing a non-peaceful consciences. Even if you play a war game like League of Legends, you cannot say that you have indirectly experienced the killing of others. The reality is that conscientious objectors have a heavy obligation to publicly demonstrate their conscientious in order to perform alternative service. Even if you play a war game like League, okay, skip. The introduction of alternative service is a step forward for conscientious objection to military service, but it also presents many challenges. A legal reform movement is underway to improve this situation. We ask for your support. Although it is still in its early stage of implementation and is being operated in a very limited manner, from the perspective of the right to peace, it is expected that the scope of alternative service through conscientious objection will expand it. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kyung-Ju Lee, for explaining the prevalence of conscientious objection in Korea and the consequences of being a conscientious objector and its connection with the right to peace. We recently had a seminar in the People's Academy on the right to peace that featured Jun Sasamoto, who is a member of the People's Academy Task Force and a primary organizer of today's seminar. He just earned his PhD in the right to peace, and the program is posted on the People's Academy website. I want to commend all four of our faculty members for excellent presentations and raising very provocative issues and sometimes even frightening issues. But we will move to the next part of our program, where we will take a few minutes or however long we want for the faculty members to interact with each other, comment on each other's presentations, or perhaps add things that you could not get to during your presentations, for example, Professor Kuznick. So I'd like to open it up now to the faculty members if you'd like to raise any issues or ask each other questions or comment on each other's presentations. Anybody?
Yeah, I've got several, but I wanted to ask Professor Lee. I guess we've got two Professor Lees, but I was wondering, given the illegality of so much, or the unconstitutionality of so much that's going on in terms of the U.S. relationship to South Korea, how much public opposition is there to that relationship? I've seen surveys that show that up to 73% of the South Korean public wants South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. So how much anti-war sentiment is there? How much opposition to U.S. control and operational control and general anti-war sentiment is there in South Korea now? I know that people are a little bit frightened by North Korea, in addition to being frightened by some people by China.
Professor Lee, do you want to respond?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. So, the most of the Korean people think about the Korean War. So because of the Korean War, it could be very good understanding for the military alliance between the Korea and the US. Most of people are so conservative, especially the older people and the Korean War generation, 70s, 80s, 60s. Nevertheless, in Korea, since 1990, civil organization peace movement has begun until now. It was a very, very important role for the balanced thinking about the alliance. Although the USA and the UNC played a very important role against the North Korean armed attack. In the meantime, the role of the US forces in Korea was a dramatic change. Regarding the Korean armistice, as you know, this year is the 80th national liberation from the Japan and from the Pacific War. So the role of the US forces first time is focused against the North Korea armed conflict and armed attack. But since 1953, actually in Korea, there were no armed conflict with North Korea. But you know, the role of the US forces must be changed. For the Korean peace and Korean reconciliation between the US, South and North Korea. Nevertheless, USA and US forces have no interest in the Korean Peninsula peace and the Korean reconciliation between two sides. US have a special interest expanding their forces out of Korean Peninsula in order to expand their imperialism forces. This keyword is quite recently alliance modernization. We civil society are very worried about it. Now, since 1990, the Korean civil society and the civil movement for peace were very fast developing in the meantime. And the Korean society showed for the conservative people, not only peace issue, but also Korean democracy, and also Korean historian of justice. So although conservative people recognized the power of the civil society for national development, in this context, gradually, I think 35–40%, this is the, I guess, agree with the peace movement. But almost people are very conservative. It's my answer. to you. Thank you.
Professor Kuznick?
I have a question for all of my Korean colleagues. I saw one poll after the meeting between President Lee and Donald Trump that said that almost 61% of South Koreans approved of the summit meeting and the way President Lee handled Donald Trump. Does that sound accurate to you? And I'm curious to know how the three of you evaluate the meeting, especially given what's going on in the aftermath with 316 South Korean workers being effectively thrown out of the country, and President Lee saying that South Korean businessmen are going to hesitate to invest in the United States when the tariff deal, part of the reason the tariff deal went through was because South Korea tried to bribe Trump with $350 billion worth of investments. And so Trump lowered the tariff from 25% to 15%. Now it looks like that deal might be unraveling. And I'm curious what your assessment is of this.
So I think even the Lee Jae-myung government and his congressmen also are very careful with the issues, U.S. forces issues, U.S. issues, and UN issues. I know almost the congressmen of the Democratic Party. Individually, they don't against it, but officially, they are very, very careful against these issues. So yes, yeah. The most of people think they are very angry with it. Nevertheless, it would be very necessary to survival to the international community. So we need economic alliance and the other cooperation with the USA. So the new government have two sides. On one hand, economically. On the other hand, peace issues. How can we harmonize these issues? Nevertheless, we as civil society are very, very careful and very angry with Lee Jae-myung government. Now, the 100th day of new government is finished. Gradually, civil society is very angry with the summit meeting between Japan and Korea, and summit meeting Korea and USA. Done. So The summit meeting between USA Korea is a kind of the subordinate diplomacy. Why? Tomorrow we are going to have the press interview regarding these issues. The estimate of the summit meeting, the new government and USA and Japan. Historical civil society is very angry with the summit meeting between the USA and Japan. But most of Korean conservative people are quite different.
Thank you. Here's a question for Mr. Lee Si-woo. What do you think that UN member states and international civil society should do to abolish the UNC now?
한국말 하겠습니다. 일단 UN 차원의
I can share a little bit. He was speaking about like the specific legality and articles within the UN command that could be used, but also specifically that there are a lot of civilian movements around anti-military bases and anti-US militarism in Japan as well as Korea, and really mobilizing around these civilian movements can also be a method of mobilizing to dismantle the UN command structure.
Thank you. For some reason, the US interpretation was not working. So people who don't speak Korean could not understand that answer. Another question. Many people are urging the General Assembly to convene under Uniting for Peace to protect the Palestinians in Gaza from the genocide by Israel. And the Uniting for Peace resolution was passed when the Security Council was deadlocked in 1950, and it was used to authorize an attack against North Korea. Would anybody like to comment on that? Okay, well, I have a question for Professor Kuznick. Project, or for anyone really, but particularly for you, Professor, Project 2025 says that China is the most dangerous threat to the United States, but the national security strategy that has not yet been published, but is reportedly about to come out, says that domestic threats are the most pose the biggest danger to the United States. And I think by this probably they mean immigrants and people who criticize Israel. Do you think that I mean, first of all, have you heard that about the national security strategy? And secondly, how do you think that Trump's mass deportation strategy and attacks on universities for allowing dissent against Israel, et cetera, adds up against what the resources that are being, maybe it's economic and not military, but the gearing up to counter China, I guess would be a way to put it.
Well, I haven't heard that yet, but it's consistent with what we see coming from Trump, with the National Guard and the Marines in the streets, the attack on the universities. You could make the case that if you were out to weaken the United States, effectively destroy the United States, you would do exactly what Trump has been doing. His immigration policy might be feeding a certain part of his base, but it's certainly weakening the U.S. economy. It's hurting the U.S. workforce. It's terrorizing the immigrant community. It's making the United States such an unwelcome place to visit or to go to school. Even before Trump, the number of students coming here from China had dropped dramatically. And now, with his latest assaults, it's going to drop further. His attacks on the university, and on education in general, and on scientific research and medical research, are the American universities were the pride of the world in many ways, uh, the envy of the world. And now, in terms of scientific research, it used to be that 8 or 9 out of the top 10 scientific institutions in the world were in the United States. Now, of the top 10 that are rated, only 1 is in the United States and 8 are in China, right? The only one in the United States is Harvard, which comes in second of the top 10. Trump is systematically dismantling everything that has made the United States strong and progressive in the past and replacing it with the seeds of fascism, stupidity, and dark age mentality. So it's, I won't be surprised if they say that. They used to say that the main threat was international terrorism. Then 2018, they changed that to China and then Russia. And if now they're going to say that uh, it's people protesting against what Israel is doing in Gaza uh, as the main threat, or crime, or immigration, this is madness. But we're seeing that kind of madness. The same thing in the context we're talking about. Why is Trump attacking U.S. allies? Weakening America's relationship to South Korea. Look what he's done to India. 50% tariffs on India. India was crucial to America's planning in Asia, not just the Quad, but America's overall strategy. And now he's driving the Indians into the arms, literally, of Russia, as Modi and Putin were holding hands together at Tianjin, and into the arms of China. So Trump's policies are so reckless, so stupid, so narcissistic, so based on personal grievances that he's weakening the United States and in ways that make no sense. So I wouldn't put anything past him at this point. But I think we have to recognize there's a lot of talk now about not demonizing our people we disagree with after the shooting. I think that's a good idea, except if somebody is an overt fascist and behaving like one, we have to still call him out, not necessarily all of his supporters, but what Trump is doing and the people around him is just mind-bogglingly stupid and very, very dangerous to the US.
Yes, and let me just add, Professor Kuznick, arresting hundreds of Korean workers at the Hyundai factory, and then talking and then sending them back to South Korea, or giving them the option of training US workers. And I guess reportedly the South Korean government took the first option. But yes, South Korea is supposedly an ally. Well, we do have a question for Professor Lee Kyung-ju. What do you think of using conscientious objection or the right to peace to oppose the U.S.-South Korea military alliance?
Hello.
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
So I would like to.
This was for Professor Kyung-jung, Lee
Yeah.
Kyung-ju, Lee Kyung-ju.
Yeah,
Yeah.
please. 오케이. 한국말로 하겠습니다. 그 양심적 병역 거부는 종교적 소수자에 의해서 시작되었습니다. 그런데 최근에는 이 평화주의적 양심에 기초해서
Could we have the interpreters, please, in the interpretation room? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah,
GUO
so
dan
it
please
was originally started
translate.
for like non-religious or
양심적
as like
부분은 종교적
for those
소수자에 의해서 시작되었습니다.
like religious
최근에는
minorities was how
평화주의적 양심에
conscientious
기초한
objection began.
개혁 거부자들도 늘어나고 있습니다.
However,
그래서 이
these days,
가운데는
people have been objecting for
한국관계에
other
대한
reasons as well.
반대의 뜻으로
This can be seen as an
미신적
objection
개혁
to
거부를 한
the
사람들도
ROK
포함되어 있을
US
거라고 봅니다.
alliance. And I
어쨌든
believe that
양심적
these individuals are also
병역거부의
probably
여러 가지
included in
것이 현실이고 그
conscientious
배경에
objectors.
평화권이 있다고 생각합니다.
The fact is that there is an increasing number of people who are conscientious objectors, and I believe that peace is at the basis of this increase.
Thank you. Would any of our faculty like to make any closing comments?
Yes.
Yes?
May,
Okay, go
may I
ahead.
say a short comment?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, the professor, Professor, I would like to comment the Kyung-Jul Lee, right to peace. Yeah, as a short comment. This is very, very important in Korean society and also in the internet community. From the international point of view, as you know, the history of the human rights in international community, the first the freedom of the human right. The second stage, the equality, focused on the equality. And the third step, the human right of a third generation. The core philosophy is the solidarity in internet community. Many areas, such as environment issues, biological issues, we need solidarity from the internet community. Even peace issue, also, we can see the right to peace from the third generation human right. In this point, he introduced the conscientious objection issue as the right to peace issue. I think it was very wonderful idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a comment in the chat from a Korean speaker that Lee Kyung-ju said conscientious objection was initiated by religious minorities. Recently, the number of conscientious objectors to military service based on a pacifist conscience has been increasing. I think there are also people who will conscientiously refuse military service in opposition to Korea-US relations. The reality is that the scope is expanding and the background is that there is a right to peace.
Yes.
Okay, well, that we're coming to a close of this wonderful seminar. I want to thank our distinguished faculty, Professor Peter Kuznick, Professor Jung-hee Lee, Professor Kyung-ju Lee, and Mr. Lee Si-woo. And also thank our interpreters, our administrator, the People's Academy Task Force, and all of you for making this seminar a success. The next program of the People's Academy of International Law will be a course called Indigenous Nations and Peoples Critique the International Law System, and it will take place on Friday, October 24th. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Congratulations, June.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.